Hello everyone, I'm glad to make the third video about my best online games. This is my game against the Grandmaster from Azerbaijan, Magerramov on ACC. It's a blitz game, 5 minutes for player. I played with white and I played a4, e5, d4, e takes d, knight f3, knight to c6, c3. Now I played this gambit. It's called Goring gambit or Scotch gambit. It's very interesting. They just sacrifice a pawn to take an advantage about the development and play aggressively. In this game, the black choose for d5, so play the main variation. In main variation, the black refused the pawn and play d5. And after e takes d, queen takes d, c takes d, the idea in this position is make pressure against the isolated pawn on d4. So the advantage of the black is that as the pawn d4 to attack, the advantage of white is that now the white has a better control of the center, thanks to the pawn d4. So bishop to g4 to make pressure against the pawn d4, attacking the knight. Bishop to e2. In this position, it's not possible to take the pawn. For example, with bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, queen d4, because in this case, I have the tactical solution, bishop takes knight, and I take the queen, so the white wins. So it's not possible to do that. Okay. For this reason, after bishop to e2, the black played bishop before check, knight to c3, and the black chooses for the main variation. It's bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and queen c4. The idea is block the castle, and in this position I played queen b3. This move is correct. In this game it's not possible to play queen takes d4 because after castle of the white, the king is on the center, and if, for example, castle on the long side, the problem is that the white has a pawn less, but the white can break the enemy castle immediately with bishop takes knight, so it's not a good solution for the black. And if knight to e7, for example, that seems logical to play castle and at the same time to close the e-file, there is bishop takes knight, and if knight takes, rook e1 check, and in case to king f8, for example, after rook to e4, seems hard for queen to defend the bishop to b4, so there is this problem. For this reason, we can consider the pawn to d4 poisoned. It's not possible to take the pawn for the black. So queen b3, the black choose to trade the queen, it's correct. I take the pawn. a6. The idea about a6 is that is to defend the pawn a7, because the pawn to a7 is the open file. So in the future it's important to defend it, especially if the black won't play the castle on the long side. So a6, castle. If the black takes d4, I can take b7, so for me it's okay. Knight to g2 e7, bishop to e3. I develop a bishop, at the same time I defend the pawn d4. Castle on the long side, making pressure against d4. And in this position, I have a problem, defend the pawn d4. I won't defend it in an active way if I can. So my idea now is defend d4 with a very nice move, rook to a4. After rook a4, I'm attacking the bishop, and it's not possible to take the pawn because there is the bishop on b4. So I defend in this good way the pawn on d4. In theory, it's possible to defend with the rook f to d1, but it's more passive because I want a rook to a4 and the other rook to c1 for the future to make pressure in the file C. So rook a4, bishop to d6, and now in theory I have a bad pawn structure. It's clear that the black pawn structure is better, but the black has problems. For example, it's not possible for the black move the knight because I can destroy the castle with bishop takes knight. So this is the first problem. And another problem now is the bishop on d6 is without squares. So after 94, when I want, I can trade the knight for the bishop, and I can play, yes, with a worst pawn structure, but with the bishop pair. So in open position, this could be okay. King to b8, rook to c1. I play with the rook in the open file. King, knight to a7 I think is correct to place the knight to b5. In this square the knight is strong because it can defend in an easy way the pawn c7. So a very nice defensive move for black now. And I trade to play with the bishop pair. Rook takes, bishop to f4. And now the black has to defend the pawn c7, so rook d7 is enforced. And rook c4 to add more pressure. Knight b5 to defend the pawn c7. Now I played bishop to e5. I'm attacking simply a pawn. And at the same time, if f6, I have also the idea bishop to g4. So the black would be forced to play f5, I think. So f6 is not good because lose a tempo. I will play bishop g4 and is forced to play f5. For this reason, the black choose it for rook g8 to defend the pawn, and I played bishop to g4. f5, forced, bishop f3. Knight to g6. And I played g3. Maybe now for black is better take the bishop, d takes and play against this pawn, because now for me it's harder to defend it. For the pawn I need to defend it with the rook. So maybe this could be an idea for black now. This is better. But the black played now rook e8, and after bishop h5, now my position is okay. I block the knight, and the next move I can play f4. My idea is, okay, give the bishop, the dark bishop, to have a passed pawn. So I lose an advantage, the bishop pair, to take another advantage, so the passed pawn. Okay, so rook to e6, f4, knight takes, d takes. It's clear that for me it's better to take with the pawn d, because the d pawn could be weak, but the pawn f4 is very strong, so it's okay. Now rook to d3. And I played rook to c2 to defend the pawn b2 in the future, after, for example, the taking rook takes b3. In this position, I don't like defend b3, because the pawn on b3, the value is very few, I think, is not important for me. It's a weak pawn, it's not important, so for me it's important, don't spend moves to defend it, but play to have an active game. So I didn't defend it for this reason. Rook c2, rook takes b3. And now a nice move is rook d2 in this position, to take the file and to threaten bishop d1. It's very nice, this move. But I didn't see it in game, and I played bishop f7 with the idea to take the pawn c with the rook. So rook e7, rook takes pawn, rook takes g3 first, check, I retake with pawn, and after that, in this position, I have a pawn less now, but I have the rook and bishop against rook and knight, and the pair, the tandem rook and bishop is better than rook and knight, so for me it's okay this. It's a equal position, I think, because the black has a pawn more, but I have a pawn less, but a passed pawn and a better, and I have a better, I have a bishop that is better than enemy knight, so this is okay. The position is open, so my bishop play very well. So king c8. Now I play the rook d6 because I need to have a strong rook. So rook d6 with the idea rook f6, for example, rook f8. And now knight to b5, rook to f6, king c7, king to f2. We have to remember that we needed to play with king in that game. In this position, my rook on f6 is very strong because block the king and cover important tiles or ranks. And it's important for me take the king on the center. So for me it's important to play with the king now. I cannot improve the position of the rook, and I cannot improve the position of the bishop. So for me it's better play with the king. King f2 is correct. Knight to d4, king to e3, knight to c6 to block the square d4. And now I play the rook f8. I cannot go to d4, so I think to improve the rook position. So rook to f8, knight to d8, bishop to b3. Now it's not so good at the bishop here. I can try to attack with the rook. And b5, rook f6 again to attack the pawn a6. And after a5, rook a6 to force the push, a4. And after bishop d5, this endgame now become good for white because the bishop block the knight, and the rook on e7 is very passive now. So yes, I have a pawn less, and but my game is very active. And now the grandmaster played rook d7, but after king d4, this game is completely lost for the black that has a pawn more, but cannot do anything. And in effect, in this position, the grandmaster resigns because not moves for him, and decide to resign because no solution. The problem in this position is that I can go with the king of c5, and if I trade all the pieces to b7, I can take is the pawn b5 is the pawn a4, so this is the first problem. But the other problem is that I can push e6, and after d6, the black hasn't squared for his rook, so I can go with the king to e5, and I can, I think, promote my pawn e. To prevent it, the black has to sacrifice a piece, I think. For this reason, this endgame is completely win for white now. So, a very nice position. The white has a pawn less, but the position is completely won because the black pieces are very passive, and the black cannot exploit these pieces, so the pawn more now is not important.